Well, for more on this across to the Ukrainian capital and speak to our correspondent in Kyiv, Gulliver Cragg. Hello to you, Gulliver. Vladimir Putin wants assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO. Is that something Ukrainians are willing to accept?
Well, Ukrainians know that Joe Biden is not going to give in to that demand, if only on the principle of the thing, that a non-NATO country like Russia should not get to decide who gets to join NATO, and certainly not by threatening force to do that. But if you look at Ukrainian support for joining NATO, pretty steadily now, survey after survey returns a result of between 50 and 60% in favour of joining NATO. So it's a clear majority, but it's not an overwhelming majority. There is a part of Ukrainian society that thinks maybe it would be worth giving up on this demand to join NATO in order to make peace with Russia, but they are in the minority, and that goal of joining NATO has now been written into Ukraine's constitution, and backpedaling on it would be pretty much politically impossible at this stage in Ukraine, because those who do strongly feel that they want the country to join NATO feel very, very strongly about it indeed, and would take to the streets if the president started backtracking on that in any way. That said, of course, Ukrainians know that they're not going to be joining NATO anytime soon, and so perhaps if Joe Biden were to kind of point out to Vladimir Putin that it's very unlikely to happen in the near future, they might not feel so bad about that, as long as it was not officially stated and written down.
Now, Gulliver, U.S. media is framing these talks between Biden and Putin as possibly the highest stake talks that Biden has had since he's taken office. How seriously are Ukrainians taking the threat of a full-scale Russian invasion?
Well, no one that I've spoken to has said that they feel they can completely rule it out in their minds. But a military expert I spoke to just now said that she thinks, perhaps paradoxically, in a way, Ukrainians are a little less jittery about it than some in the West, and particularly in the United States are, partly because they're used to living in a state of war anyway, and partly because, looking at it from a pragmatic point of view, they just can't see why Putin could think that this would be the best way to achieve his goals. Because invading Ukraine, launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, would mean very serious fighting on the ground. Ukrainians would fight and impose heavy losses on Russia. The West would, of course, have to react with sanctions and very probably with greatly increased military aid to Ukraine. Those are all things that Vladimir Putin doesn't want. So they look at it from a pragmatic point of view and think it really makes sense for Vladimir Putin to be bluffing on this in order to wrest concessions from the West. It wouldn't really make sense for him to actually launch a full-scale invasion. But what they do think is possible is an intensification of the fighting in Donbass on a smaller scale, or perhaps some kind of fighting around the border between Ukraine and the annexed peninsula of Crimea. They do think that it's highly likely that there'll be some kind of escalation done in order to put more pressure on Ukraine, but that Russia would probably continue to do that under the cover of the so-called separatists, its proxies, if you like, in eastern Ukraine, rather than really launching an official full-scale invasion.
All right, Gulliver, thank you very much. Gulliver Cragg reporting from Kyiv.